The year was 1885, and in the untamed territories of the American West, some names were whispered in saloons and shouted in fear. Jack Lightning Morrison was one of those names, a legend carved from gunpowder and glory, a man whose reputation could clear a street faster than a prairie fire. They said he'd never lost a draw. They said he could put 6 bullets through a silver dollar at 50 paces. They said he'd killed more men than the cholera, and that death followed him like a faithful dog. What they didn't say, what no one knew, was that the most dangerous gunslinger in 3 territories had a heart that belonged completely to a schoolteacher named Rosalind Whitman. Jack Morrison had loved exactly one woman in his 35 years, and loving her had been both his salvation and his greatest torment. Because when you're marked for death by every ambitious gunfighter and vengeful outlaw from California to Kansas, love becomes a liability that can get the people you care about killed. 5 years ago, Jack had made the hardest decision of his life. He'd walked away from the only woman who'd ever made him want to hang up his guns and become something better than a legend built on violence. He'd left Millbrook, Colorado, in the dead of night, taking nothing but his horse, his weapons, and a heart that felt like it had been torn from his chest. Rosalind Rosa. Whitman had been 23 then, beautiful, brilliant, and brave enough to love a man that decent folks crossed the street to avoid. She'd seen past the reputation to the soul underneath, past the fear others showed him to the gentleness he'd tried so hard to bury. She'd made him laugh, made him hope, made him believe that maybe a killer could learn to build instead of destroy. But love, Jack had learned, wasn't always enough to keep the people you cherish safe. Now, 5 years of lonely trails and empty victories later, Jack Morrison was riding back to Millbrook with the desperate understanding that leaving Rosa hadn't protected her. It had just made them both miserable. He'd spent half a decade trying to forget her smile, her laugh, the way she said his name like it was something precious instead of cursed. You're about to witness what happens when the most feared gunslinger in the West discovers that the greatest danger isn't the men hunting him. It's the possibility of losing the woman he loves forever. How a man who'd built his life on violence learns that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is fight for love instead of running from it. This is the story of Jack Morrison, who thought he was protecting Rosa by leaving, and discovered that life without her was no life at all. Of Rosa Whitman, who'd spent 5 years believing she wasn't worth staying for, until the day her legendary love came riding back into town, like an answer to prayers she'd stopped believing anyone would hear. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is fall in love with someone who's afraid they're too broken to deserve happiness. And sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin when someone finally finds the courage to stop running and start fighting for the future they were too scared to claim. In Millbrook, Colorado, where the mountains touch the sky and legends walk the dusty streets, 2 hearts that had been broken by separation were about to discover whether love really could conquer fear. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't the one won with guns. Sometimes it's the one won with courage enough to come home. The dust kicked up by Jack Morrison's black stallion settled like a curtain behind him as he crested the hill overlooking Millbrook, Colorado. 5 years had passed since he'd last seen this valley, but every detail was burned into his memory with the precision of a man who'd replayed this moment in his mind 1,000 sleepless nights. The town had grown. New buildings lined Main Street, and he could see the white steeple of a church that hadn't been there when he'd left. But some things remained unchanged. The mountains still stood guard over the valley like ancient sentinels, and the late afternoon sun still painted everything in shades of gold that reminded him of Rosa's hair when she laughed. Jack's hands tightened on the reins, his heart hammering against his ribs with a rhythm that had nothing to do with the long ride, and everything to do with the woman who might still be living in the little house behind the schoolhouse. Rosa Whitman. The name was a prayer and a curse, spoken in the silence of his mind like a secret too precious to voice aloud. Thunder, his stallion, shifted restlessly beneath him, sensing his rider's tension. Jack had ridden into hostile territory more times than he could count, faced down gangs of armed men without breaking a sweat. But riding back to face the woman he'd abandoned felt more dangerous than any gunfight he'd ever survived. What if she'd married? The thought had tormented him for 5 years, a constant ache worse than any bullet wound. What if she'd found someone safer, someone who could give her the peaceful life she deserved. What if she took one look at him and told him to keep riding, that she'd learned to live without him and preferred it that way? But beneath the fear lay something stronger, a desperate hope that had finally overcome his caution after 5 years of empty victories and hollow nights. He'd tried to forget her, tried to convince himself that leaving had been noble, that he'd saved her from a life of looking over her shoulder and wondering if this would be the day someone faster than Jack Morrison came calling. Instead, he'd condemned them both to a different kind of suffering. Jack guided Thunder down the winding road toward town, noting the curious stares from folks who recognized the legendary gunslinger, even after all these years. He touched the brim of his hat politely to the women who hurried their children indoors, nodded respectfully to the men who watched him with a mixture of wariness and fascination. Millbrook had always been a peaceful place, the kind of town where Jack's reputation preceded him like thunder before lightning. Main Street stretched before him, familiar yet foreign. Peterson's general store had expanded, and there was a new saloon called the Silver Dollar, where Murphy's old place used to be. But Jack's eyes were searching for something else, someone else, and his heart nearly stopped when he saw her. Rosa Whitman stood outside the schoolhouse, dismissing her students for the day. She looked exactly as he remembered and completely different at the same time. Still beautiful, still graceful, but there was something in the set of her shoulders that spoke of strength earned through solitude, of a woman who'd learned to stand on her own. Her dark brown hair was pulled back in a practical bun, but rebellious strands caught the afternoon light like spun silk. She wore a simple blue dress that complemented her eyes, and when she smiled at one of her young students, Jack felt his chest tighten with a mixture of love and loss so intense it nearly knocked him from the saddle. 5 years collapsed into nothing. 5 years of telling himself he'd made the right choice, of convincing himself that distance was kindness, of believing that loving someone sometimes meant letting them go. All of it crumbled the moment he saw Rosa laugh at something one of the children said, her face lighting up with the same joy that had first captured his heart. As if sensing his presence, Rosa looked up from her students and her gaze found his across the dusty street. The world seemed to stop. The sounds of the town, children's laughter, wagon wheels, conversation, all faded into silence as two people who'd once shared everything stared at each other across the years that lay between them, like an unbridgeable chasm. Rosa's face went pale, then flushed with color. Her hand moved instinctively to her throat, a gesture Jack remembered from their courting days when she was nervous or excited. For a moment, neither of them moved, neither breathed, caught in the gravity of a connection that 5 years and 1,000 miles hadn't managed to sever. Then Rosa turned abruptly away, ushering her remaining students toward their homes with gentle but firm words Jack couldn't hear from this distance. Her movements were deliberate, controlled, but he could see the tension in every line of her body. She was trying not to look at him again, trying to pretend that seeing him hadn't affected her. But Jack had spent years learning to read people's intentions in split seconds, and he could see the tremor in Rosa's hands, the careful way she avoided glancing in his direction. She was no more immune to his presence than he was to hers. The last of the children scattered toward their homes, and Rosa stood alone on the schoolhouse steps. For a heartbeat, Jack thought she might acknowledge him, might cross the street and demand explanations for the questions that had probably haunted her for 5 years. Instead, she gathered her skirts and walked quickly toward the small house behind the school. The same house where she lived with her aunt. The same house where Jack had spent countless evenings learning that love was more than passion, that it could be gentle and constant in healing. Jack dismounted slowly, his legs unsteady, not from the long ride, but from the emotional impact of seeing Rosa again. He'd imagined this moment countless times, played out a dozen different scenarios in his mind, but none of them had prepared him for the reality of being so close to her and yet feeling the weight of all the hurt and time that stood between them. Jack Morrison. The voice belonged to Sheriff Tom Bradley, a man Jack remembered as fair-minded and decent, someone who understood that not all legends were built on villainy. Been a long time. Sheriff, Jack replied, turning to face the older man while keeping Rosa's house in his peripheral vision. 5 years. You planning on staying or just passing through? It was a reasonable question from a lawman concerned about keeping the peace in his town. Jack's reputation might draw trouble the way honey drew flies, and Bradley had a responsibility to his community. That depends, Jack said honestly, on whether I'm welcome. Bradley studied him with shrewd eyes that had seen enough of life to recognize the difference between a man looking for trouble and a man trying to escape it. You're welcome as long as you keep that gun holstered and remember that this is a peaceful town. I remember, Jack assured him. I've got no quarrel with anyone in Millbrook, Sheriff. I'm just looking to make amends for some old mistakes. Bradley's gaze flicked toward Rosa's house, understanding dawning in his expression. Like everyone in town, he probably knew about Jack and Rosa's relationship. Probably remembered how the legendary gunslinger had courted the schoolteacher with the gentleness of a man handling spun glass. Some mistakes take more than words to fix, Bradley said quietly. And some folks aren't ready to forgive just because someone finally finds the courage to come home. I know, Jack replied, but I had to try. As Sheriff Bradley walked away, Jack stood in the middle of Main Street, holding Thunder's reins and staring at Rosa's house. Light glowed behind the curtains, warm and inviting, painting pictures of the domestic life he'd walked away from. He could imagine her inside, preparing dinner, grading her students' papers, living the quiet life he'd thought she was better off living without him. But now he was here, and everything he'd convinced himself was true felt like lies built on cowardice. He'd told himself he was protecting Rosa by leaving. The truth was, he'd been protecting himself from the possibility of losing her to violence he couldn't control. Tomorrow he would find the courage to knock on that door. Tomorrow he would face the woman he'd never stopped loving and try to find words for the apology he'd been rehearsing for 5 years. Tomorrow he would discover whether love could survive the kind of abandonment that came wrapped in good intentions. Tonight he would find a room at the hotel and lie awake remembering what it felt like to believe in happily ever after. Because Jack Morrison had finally learned that the most dangerous thing wasn't loving someone who could get you killed. It was loving someone you'd already lost to your own fear. Jack spent the night at the Millbrook Hotel, lying on a narrow bed and staring at the ceiling, while the town settled into peaceful slumber around him. Every creak of the building, every distant sound from the street below, reminded him that he was back in the place where he'd once believed in forever. Sleep eluded him like smoke, and when dawn finally painted the mountains in shades of rose and gold, he rose feeling like a man preparing for his own execution. He'd faced down the fastest guns in 3 territories, but the thought of knocking on Rosa's door made his hands shake like a greenhorn's before his first draw. By 8 o'clock, he was standing on Main Street, freshly shaved and wearing the cleanest clothes he owned. A white shirt pressed at the hotel, dark pants, and boots polished to mirror shine. He'd left his gun belt in his room, a gesture he hoped Rosa would understand. He wasn't here as Lightning Morrison, the legendary gunslinger. He was here as Jack, the man who'd loved her and lost her through his own cowardice. The schoolhouse sat quiet in the morning light, too early for students, but not too early for a teacher who'd always been an early riser. Jack remembered how Rosa used to greet the dawn with coffee and lesson plans, how she'd hum while she prepared for the day ahead. The memory was so vivid it made his chest ache. He walked the familiar path to her house, each step carrying him closer to either redemption or final rejection. The small garden she'd always tended was still there, though more elaborate now, roses climbing a white trellis, vegetable plants arranged in neat rows, herbs growing in carefully labeled patches. It looked like the work of someone who'd found solace in making things grow, someone who'd learned to nurture life when the thing she'd most wanted to nurture had walked away. Jack raised his hand to knock, then hesitated. What if she refused to see him? What if she called for the sheriff? What if... The door opened before his knuckles could touch wood, and Rosa stood there looking at him with an expression that made his heart stop and break simultaneously. She was beautiful, more beautiful than memory had painted her, but there was pain in her eyes that hadn't been there 5 years ago, pain he'd put there. I wondered how long you'd stand out there gathering courage, Rosa said, her voice carefully controlled, but carrying undertones of hurt that cut Jack deeper than any blade. Rosa! Her name came out rough, weighted with 5 years of longing and regret. I don't. She held up a hand, stopping his words. Don't you dare start with pretty speeches and explanations. Not yet. Come inside before the whole town sees you on my doorstep and starts talking. She stepped back, and Jack entered the house that had once felt like home. It was exactly as he remembered, yet completely different. The same furniture, the same cozy warmth, but now it felt like a museum of their lost love. Books were stacked on every surface, testament to lonely evenings spent reading instead of sharing conversation. A single teacup sat on the kitchen table, a reminder that she'd learned to dine alone. Rosa closed the door and leaned against it, her arms crossed defensively over her chest. She was wearing a simple green dress that brought out the color of her eyes that were studying him with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle that had been tormenting her for years. "You look older," she said finally, her voice neutral as morning mist. "So do you." It was true, but she looked older in the way that came from wisdom and strength rather than mere years. "More beautiful, too." Rosa's laugh was sharp, bitter. "Don't you dare try to charm me, Jack Morrison. Don't you dare stand in my house after 5 years and think sweet words will make this easy." "I don't think anything about this is easy," Jack replied honestly. "I know I hurt you. I know I don't deserve." "You don't know anything," Rosa interrupted, her careful control finally cracking. "You don't know what it was like to wake up and find you gone without a word. You don't know what it was like to wait for letters that never came, to make excuses to people who asked where my fiancé had disappeared to wonder if you were dead in some dusty street or if you just decided I wasn't worth staying for." The pain in her voice hit Jack like physical blows. "Rosa, please let me explain." "Explain what?" "How easy it was to leave. How little I meant to you. How quickly you forgot about the woman who loved you enough to overlook what everyone said about you." Rosa's voice rose with each word, 5 years of suppressed anguish finally finding voice. "Do you have any idea what it's like to give your whole heart to someone and have them disappear like morning mist?" Jack took a step toward her, his own heart breaking at the anguish in her eyes. "You meant everything to me. You still do. That's why I had to leave." "That makes no sense." Rosa's composure shattered completely. "People don't abandon the ones they love. They fight for them, protect them, stay and face whatever comes together." "Not when loving them puts them in danger," Jack said quietly. "Not when staying means watching them die because of who you are." Rosa stared at him, tears streaming down her face now, her anger warring with confusion. "What are you talking about?" Jack ran his hands through his hair, struggling to find words for truths he'd carried alone for 5 years. "The Carver gang, remember them? 3 brothers from Kansas who'd been hunting me for 2 years after I killed their cousin in a fair fight. What do they have to do with—" "They found out about you," Jack said, his voice rough with remembered terror. "Found out about us. The night before I left, I got word from a friend in Denver that they were riding toward Millbrook. They weren't coming for me, Rosa. They were coming for you." Rosa's anger faltered, replaced by shock. "What?" "They knew they couldn't take me in a fair fight, so they were going to take something I cared about more than my own life. They were going to hurt you, kill you maybe, and make me watch." Jack's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "They said they'd make me suffer the way they'd suffered, and then they'd kill me too." The color drained from Rosa's face. "You never told me. How could I? How could I tell the woman I loved that caring about me had put her life in danger? How could I ask you to live with the knowledge that any day might bring killers to your door because you'd chosen to love Jack Morrison?" Rosa sank into a chair, her legs suddenly unsteady. "So you left to protect me." "I left because I was a coward," Jack said harshly. "I told myself it was noble, that I was saving you. But the truth is, I couldn't bear the thought of watching you die because of me. I couldn't live with knowing that my reputation, my past, had destroyed the most beautiful thing in my life." Silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of revealed truths and wasted years. Rosa stared at her hands, processing everything he'd told her, while Jack stood frozen, waiting for her judgment. "What happened to them?" Rosa asked finally. "The Carver gang. Dead," Jack said simply. "All 3 of them. I tracked them down 2 years ago and ended it. And you still didn't come back." Jack's throat tightened. By then I figured you'd moved on, found someone better, someone safe. I figured I'd lost the right to your love when I chose fear over trust. Rosa looked up at him then, her eyes still bright with tears but no longer blazing with anger. Do you see anyone else here, Jack? Do you see evidence of the safe, stable life you thought I'd build without you? Jack looked around the house again, really seeing it this time. No masculine touches, no signs of another man's presence. Just Rosa, alone, surrounded by the life she'd built in solitude. You waited, he whispered, hardly daring to believe it. I waited because I'm a fool, Rosa said, but her voice was softer now. I waited because I knew you, Jack Morrison. Knew you weren't the kind of man who'd abandon someone without reason. I just didn't know what the reason was. And now that you do? Rosa stood slowly, crossing the small space between them until she was close enough to touch. Now I understand why you left. But Jack, don't you see? You made that choice for both of us. You decided what I could handle, what I was worth risking, what kind of life I deserved. You never gave me the chance to choose. Jack felt his heart breaking all over again. Rosa, I was trying to save you. I didn't need saving from loving you, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I needed you to trust me enough to face whatever came together. I needed you to believe that our love was worth fighting for, not running from. She reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the lines that 5 years of loneliness had carved around his eyes. I would have chosen you, Jack. Danger and all. I would have chosen us. Jack covered her hand with his, pressing her palm against his cheek. I know that now. Lord help me, Rosa. I know that now. I've spent 5 years learning that living without you isn't living at all. It's just surviving, and I'm tired of just surviving. So what now? Rosa asked. What happens now that you've come home? Jack looked into her eyes and saw his future written there. Not easy, not simple, but real and true and worth every risk he'd been too afraid to take 5 years ago. Now I ask you to forgive me, he said, and I ask you to let me prove that I've learned the difference between protecting someone and trusting them. I ask you to let me love you the way I should have loved you from the beginning, without conditions, without fear, without running when things get difficult. Rosa studied his face for a long moment, searching for something that would help her decide whether to trust her heart to the man who'd already broken it once. It's going to take time, she said finally. Trust isn't rebuilt in a day, Jack. Love isn't either, not after this much hurt. I know, Jack said, hope and relief flooding through him at her words. I've got time, all the time in the world if that's what it takes. Rosa smiled then, the first real smile she'd given him since his return, and Jack felt like a man granted pardon on the gallows. Then let's start with coffee, she said, and you can tell me about every single day you were gone. All of them, Jack. If we're going to rebuild this, I need to understand where you've been. As Rosa moved to prepare coffee, Jack settled at her kitchen table and began the long process of rebuilding the trust he'd shattered 5 years ago. It would take time, patience, and more honesty than he'd ever given anyone. But for the first time in years, Jack Morrison believed in tomorrow again. Rosa looked at him then, really looked at him, and Jack saw years of longing and hurt and hope warring in her green eyes. I never stopped, she whispered. Lord help me. I tried to, but I never stopped. The admission broke the careful distance they'd been maintaining. Jack reached for her hand, and Rosa didn't pull away. Her fingers intertwined with his as naturally as breathing, as if 5 years hadn't passed, as if his leaving had been a bad dream they'd both awakened from. I love you, Rosa Whitman, Jack said, his voice rough with emotion. I loved you when I left. I loved you every day I was gone, and I'll love you until my last breath. If you'll let me, I'd like to spend the rest of my life proving that to you. Rosa's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. Show me, she said softly. Show me you're not going to disappear again. Show me you're really here to stay. Jack lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. How? Stay for dinner, stay past sunset, stay until I believe this isn't just another dream I'll wake up from alone. Rosa, Jack said, understanding the magnitude of what she was asking. In a small town like Millbrook, a man staying past dark at an unmarried woman's house was tantamount to declaring serious intentions. Are you sure? People will talk. Let them, Rosa said with a defiance that reminded Jack why he'd fallen in love with her courage. I'm tired of caring what people think. I'm tired of being careful and proper and alone. If you're asking me to trust you with my heart again, then I'm asking you to trust me with your reputation. Jack brought her hand to his cheek, closing his eyes as he felt the warmth of her touch. My reputation doesn't matter. You're the only thing that matters. As if to seal their renewed commitment, Rosa leaned forward and touched her forehead to his. They sat like that for a moment, breathing the same air, sharing the same space, remembering what it felt like to be two parts of the same whole. I should start dinner, Rosa said eventually, but she made no move to pull away. I should help, Jack replied, equally reluctant to break their closeness. You can't cook, Rosa reminded him with a soft laugh. I can learn. I've got time now. All the time in the world. They stood together, hands still joined, and Jack felt something settle in his chest. A peace he hadn't known since the night he'd ridden away from everything that mattered. Rosa led him into her kitchen, and for the first time in 5 years, Jack Morrison felt like he was exactly where he belonged. That evening, as they shared dinner by lamplight and Rosa laughed at his clumsy attempts to help with the dishes, Jack made a silent promise to the woman who'd waited for him against all reason and hope. He would never leave her again. Whatever came, danger, gossip, the ghosts of his violent past, they would face it together. Because Rosa was right. Love wasn't about running from trouble. It was about finding someone worth standing and fighting for. And Rosa Whitman was worth everything. A week had passed since Jack began staying for dinner, and Millbrook had settled into a new rhythm that included the legendary gunslinger, walking Rosa to school each morning and helping her tend her garden each afternoon. The townspeople had stopped staring, accepting that Jack Morrison wasn't just passing through, he was home to stay. It was Thursday morning when everything changed. Jack was splitting firewood behind Rosa's house, his shirt sleeves rolled up against the warmth of the day, when he heard the sound that made his blood run cold. Hoofbeats, fast, urgent, and coming from the direction of the main road. He set down his axe and moved to where he could see the street, his hand instinctively checking for the gun that wasn't there. 3 riders thundered into town, their horses lathered with sweat and dust. Jack recognized the type immediately. Hard men with dead eyes and weapons worn easy in their holsters. Trouble, looking for someone to collect it. The lead rider pulled up in front of the sheriff's office, and Jack's heart nearly stopped when he saw the man's face. Danny Reeves, a gun-for-hire Jack had tangled with 2 years back in New Mexico. Reeves had sworn vengeance then, but Jack had figured the man was all talk and tobacco spit. Apparently, he'd figured wrong. Rosa, Jack called softly, stepping inside where she was grading papers at her kitchen table. I need you to listen carefully and do exactly what I tell you. Rosa looked up, immediately sensing the change in his tone. What's wrong? There are men in town looking for me. Bad men. I need you to pack a bag and go stay with your friend Martha until this is over. Rosa's face went pale, but her jaw set with familiar determination. No. Rosa, this isn't a discussion. You're right, it's not. Rosa stood up, crossing her arms. I told you I was tired of being left out of decisions that affect my life. If there's trouble, we face it together. These men will kill you just to hurt me, Jack said desperately. Please, Rosa, I can't lose you again. Especially not like that. Before Rosa could respond, heavy boots sounded on her front porch, followed by a sharp knock. Jack's blood turned to ice. Morrison! Danny Reeves's voice carried through the door like a rusty blade. I know you're in there. Come on out and let's finish what we started in Santa Fe. Jack moved quickly, positioning himself between Rosa and the door. Stay behind me, he whispered. Jack Morrison, Reeves called again. You got something that belongs to me. 2 years of my reputation after you made me look like a fool. Time to collect the debt. Rosa moved to the window, carefully peering through the curtain. There are 3 of them, she whispered. Armed, and they look mean as rattlesnakes. Jack's mind raced. His gun was back at the hotel, a 10-minute walk that might as well have been 10 miles. He'd grown complacent in these peaceful days with Rosa, forgotten that his past had a way of hunting him down no matter how far he ran. Morrison, Reeves's patience was wearing thin. I see smoke from your woman's chimney. Be a shame if something happened to her, because you're too yellow to face me like a man. That did it. Jack's fear transformed into cold rage. Rosa, is there another way out of here? The back door leads to the garden, but Jack, when I give you the signal, you run. Run to the sheriff's office and tell Bradley what's happening. I'm not leaving you to face three armed men with nothing but your bare hands, Rosa said fiercely. Jack turned to look at her. This woman who'd already sacrificed 5 years of her life for loving him. Rosa, please, I can't think straight if I'm worrying about you. Let me handle this my way. Rosa stared at him for a long moment, then nodded reluctantly. But if you get yourself killed, Jack Morrison, I'll never forgive you. Despite everything, Jack almost smiled. I'll keep that in mind. Last chance, Morrison, Reeves shouted. Come out now, or we come in shooting. Jack looked around Rosa's kitchen, searching for anything he could use as a weapon. His eyes fell on Rosa's cast-iron skillet, heavy enough to cave in a skull if wielded properly. It would have to do. Rosa, he said quietly, when I open that door, you run. Don't look back. Don't hesitate. Just run. Rosa grabbed his arm. Jack, there has to be another way. There is, Jack said grimly. I could have kept running 5 years ago. Could have stayed gone and let you build a life without me. But running doesn't solve anything, Rosa. It just postpones the reckoning. The sound of splintering wood interrupted them as Reeves apparently decided to stop waiting. The front door burst open, and 3 armed men filled Rosa's small living room like shadows given substance. Well, well, Reeves drawled, his gun already drawn. Jack Morrison, domestic as a house cat. How the mighty have fallen. Danny, Jack replied calmly, stepping forward to shield Rosa completely. You're looking well for a man who should be dead. Funny thing about that, Reeves said, his eyes glittering with malice. Turns out I'm harder to kill than you thought. Of course, I can't say the same for your lady friend here. You want me, Danny? Let her go. Reeves laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Oh, I want you dead, Morrison. But first, I want you to watch her suffer. Want you to know what it feels like to lose everything. Same as you did to me. You lost fair and square, Jack said. That duel in Santa Fe was your call. My call, but your bullet that ruined my reputation. Do you know what it's like being the man who couldn't outdraw Jack Morrison? Do you know how hard it is to find work when everyone knows you're second best? Jack edged closer, the skillet hidden behind his back. So you came all this way to prove something to yourself? I came to prove something to everyone, Reeves snarled, starting with putting a bullet in your woman. Everything happened at once. Reeves swung his gun toward Rosa. Jack lunged forward with the skillet, and Rosa, brave, foolish Rosa, threw herself sideways to give Jack a clear shot at his target. The skillet connected with Reeves's wrist with a sickening crack, sending his gun flying across the room. Jack followed through with his shoulder, driving Reeves back against the wall while the other 2 men scrambled to get clear shots without hitting their leader. Rosa, run! Jack shouted, grappling with Reeves for control. But Rosa had other ideas. Instead of fleeing, she grabbed Reeves's fallen gun and pointed it at the 2 remaining gunmen, her hands steady despite the chaos. Drop your weapons, she said, her voice calm as Sunday morning. Now. The gunman hesitated, clearly not expecting resistance from a school teacher. I said drop them, Rosa repeated, and this time there was steel in her voice that would have made Jack proud if he hadn't been busy trying to keep Reeves from pulling a knife. The sound of running boots announced Sheriff Bradley's arrival with 2 deputies, drawn by the commotion. The remaining gunmen, seeing themselves outnumbered, reluctantly dropped their weapons. Well, Bradley said, surveying the scene with professional calm, looks like you folks have been busy. Jack finally got Reeves pinned, the man's broken wrist making him easy to subdue. Sheriff, I'd like to press charges for attempted murder and breaking and entering. Sounds reasonable, Bradley replied. Rosa, you can put that gun down now. We've got this handled. Rosa carefully set down the weapon, her hands finally beginning to shake now that the immediate danger had passed. Jack was at her side instantly, pulling her into his arms. That was the bravest, most foolish thing I've ever seen, he murmured against her hair. I told you we were in this together, Rosa replied, her voice muffled against his chest. As the sheriff led the three men away in shackles, Rosa and Jack stood in her damaged living room, holding each other and processing what had just happened. Is it over? Rosa asked. Jack looked around at the splintered door, the overturned furniture, the evidence of violence that had invaded their peaceful sanctuary. Then he looked at Rosa, courageous, loyal Rosa, who'd faced down armed men rather than abandon him. The immediate threat is over, he said carefully. But Rosa, this is what my life is like. This is what loving me means. There will always be another Danny Reeves, another man looking to make his reputation by killing mine. Rosa pulled back to look at him directly. Then we'll face them together. All of them, Jack, because I'm not running anymore, and I'm not letting you run either. Jack stared at this woman who continued to amaze him with her strength and determination. Rosa Whitman, will you marry me? The proposal came out of nowhere, spurred by adrenaline and love, and the crystal-clear understanding that he couldn't face another day without her by his side officially and completely. Rosa's eyes widened, then filled with tears. Yes, she whispered. Yes, you stubborn, dangerous, wonderful man. Yes. As Jack kissed his future wife in the ruins of her living room, he finally understood what Rosa had been trying to tell him all along. Love wasn't about avoiding danger. It was about finding someone worth facing any danger for. And Rosa Whitman was worth everything the world could throw at them. The news of Jack's proposal spread through Millbrook faster than wildfire in dry grass. By noon the next day, every woman in town had found an excuse to visit Rosa and offer congratulations and advice about marrying a man with Jack Morrison's reputation. You sure about this, honey? Asked Mrs. Patterson, Rosa's elderly neighbor, as they sat on the repaired front porch drinking tea. That man's got more enemies than a politician. Rosa smiled, watching Jack help rebuild her front door with wood donated by half the men in town. I'm sure, Mrs. Patterson, more sure than I've ever been about anything. The truth was, yesterday's attack had changed something fundamental between them. Seeing Jack fight for her, seeing her fight alongside him, had burned away the last of Rosa's doubts. This was the man she'd waited 5 years for, and no amount of danger would make her let go again. When's the wedding? Asked Sarah Bradley, the sheriff's wife. Saturday, Rosa replied, causing several women to nearly choke on their tea. This Saturday? Rosa, dear, that's only 3 days away. We've waited long enough, Rosa said firmly. 5 years too long. That afternoon, as if the whole town had decided to adopt their romance as a community project, Millbrook transformed into a hive of wedding preparation. Mrs. Patterson volunteered to make the cake, the ladies' auxiliary took charge of decorations, and even the saloon owner offered to close early so his piano player could provide music. Jack found Rosa in her garden that evening, surrounded by bolts of fabric as Martha Collins helped alter her mother's wedding dress. Having second thoughts? Jack asked, settling beside her on the garden bench. Never, Rosa replied, then smiled mischievously. Though I am wondering if I should have asked you first if you actually want to get married in front of the entire town. Jack laughed, the sound warm and genuine. Rosa, I'd marry you in the middle of Main Street at high noon if that's what you wanted. I don't care who's watching. Martha looked up from her sewing. That's good because half of Colorado territory seems to be coming. Word's gotten out that Lightning Morrison is getting hitched. Let them come, Jack said, taking Rosa's hand. Let the whole world see that I'm the luckiest man alive. Friday evening brought an unexpected visitor. Jack was having dinner with Rosa when Sheriff Bradley knocked on the newly repaired door. Jack, Rosa, Bradley said, removing his hat. Got someone here, wants to meet you both. Behind the sheriff stood a distinguished man in a black suit with silver hair and kind eyes. Mr. Morrison, Miss Whitman, I'm Judge Harrison from Denver. I've ridden quite a ways to perform your ceremony if you'll have me. Jack stood, confused. Judge, I appreciate the offer, but we've already arranged for Reverend Matthews. I know Danny Reeves, the judge interrupted quietly. Knew his family back in Kansas. When I heard he'd tracked you here, I had to come see for myself what kind of man inspires that degree of hatred, and what kind of woman inspires a man to change his whole life. Judge Harrison looked around Rosa's small house, taking in the evidence of domestic happiness. I've presided over a lot of weddings, Mr. Morrison. Most of them are just legal contracts between families. But every now and then, you see something real, something worth celebrating properly. What are you saying, Judge? Rosa asked. I'm saying that if Lightning Morrison has found someone who can tame his wild heart, then their wedding deserves to be performed by someone who understands the magnitude of that miracle. Rosa felt tears spring to her eyes. We'd be honored, Judge Harrison. Saturday dawned clear and bright, with the kind of golden sunshine that seemed designed for new beginnings. Rosa woke early, her heart fluttering with nervous excitement. Today, she would finally become Mrs. Jack Morrison. Martha arrived with a team of ladies to help her prepare, transforming Rosa's simple bedroom into a bridal salon. The wedding dress, altered to perfection, hung like a cloud of ivory silk and lace. You look beautiful, Martha said as she fastened the last of the pearl buttons. Like an angel. Rosa studied herself in the mirror. The dress had been her mother's, worn once and carefully preserved. Now it would see another generation of love, another promise of forever. Meanwhile, Jack was getting ready at the hotel with considerably less fuss. Sheriff Bradley had volunteered as his best man, and the two men stood in Jack's small room adjusting collar studs and fighting with neckties. Nervous? Bradley asked. Terrified, Jack admitted. Not about marrying Rosa, that's the only thing I've ever been completely sure about, but about being worthy of her, about keeping her safe and happy. Son, you've already proved you're willing to die for her. Now you just have to prove you're willing to live for her. That's the harder part. At 4 o'clock, the entire population of Millbrook seemed to have gathered at the small church. Jack stood at the altar with Judge Harrison, watching the door and trying to calm his racing heart. Then the music began, and Rosa appeared in the doorway like a vision made real. She was breathtaking in white silk and her grandmother's pearls, but it was her smile that stopped Jack's breath. She was radiant with happiness, glowing with the joy of a woman who'd waited years for this moment and was finally claiming it. Jack couldn't take his eyes off her as she walked down the aisle. 5 years ago, he'd been too afraid to imagine this moment. Now it was happening, and it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Dearly beloved, Judge Harrison began, we are gathered today to witness something rare and precious, the union of two hearts that have weathered separation and emerged stronger for it. The ceremony passed in a blur of spoken vows and exchanged rings. Jack promised to love Rosa without condition, to trust her with his whole heart, to build a life worthy of the gift she was giving him. Rosa promised to stand by him through whatever came, to believe in their love even when the world doubted it, to choose him every day for all the days of her life. By the power vested in me, by Colorado territory, I now pronounce you husband and wife, Judge Harrison declared. Jack, you may kiss your bride. Jack cupped Rosa's face in his hands, looking into her eyes and seeing his whole future there. Mrs. Morrison, he whispered. Mr. Morrison, she whispered back. Their kiss was gentle, reverent, witnessed by a church full of people who'd watched their love story unfold and wanted to see it have a happy ending. As they walked back down the aisle hand in hand, Jack felt the last of his old fears fall away. This was home. Rosa was home. Whatever came next, they'd face it together. That evening, as they danced under the stars to music played by the entire town, Jack held his wife close and marveled at the journey that had brought them here. Any regrets? Rosa asked, echoing the question that had become their private joke. Only that we waited so long, Jack replied, spinning her in a circle that made her laugh with pure joy. Well, Mr. Morrison, we have the rest of our lives to make up for lost time. I love you, Mrs. Morrison. I love you too, you wonderful, stubborn, perfect man. As they swayed together under the Colorado stars, surrounded by friends who'd become family, and blessed by a love that had survived everything the world could throw at them, Jack Morrison finally understood what he'd been searching for all those lonely years. Home wasn't a place. It was a person who chose to love you despite your flaws, who saw past your reputation to your heart, who was brave enough to fight for your happiness even when you weren't sure you deserved it. Home was Rosa, and Jack Morrison was finally completely, blissfully home. 6 months had passed since Rosa became Mrs. Jack Morrison, and the little house behind the schoolhouse had been transformed into something neither of them had dared to dream of during their years apart. A home filled with laughter, love, and the quiet contentment that came from being exactly where you belonged. Jack woke each morning to the sight of Rosa's face on the pillow beside him, and every single day it felt like a miracle he didn't deserve, but was grateful to receive. This morning was no different, except for the way Rosa's hand rested protectively over her still flat stomach, a gesture that had become habit over the past few weeks. "Good morning, beautiful," Jack whispered, pressing a gentle kiss to her temple. Rosa stirred in his arms, a soft smile curving her lips before her eyes even opened. "Good morning, husband." The word still sent warmth flooding through Jack's chest. Husband. After years of being known as Lightning Morrison, the feared gunslinger, he was simply Jack, Rosa's Jack, and soon to be father to their child. "How are you feeling today?" Jack asked, his hand covering hers where it rested over their growing baby. "Better," Rosa replied, though Jack could see the lingering traces of the morning sickness that had been plaguing her for weeks. "Doctor, Mitchell says it should ease up soon." Jack helped her sit up slowly, arranging pillows behind her back with the careful attention he'd shown everything related to her condition. When they'd first learned about the baby 2 months ago, Jack had been terrified, not of being a father, but of somehow failing to protect both Rosa and their child. The fear had kept him awake for nights, until Rosa had finally taken his face in her hands and reminded him that fear was just love with nowhere to go. "I've been thinking," Rosa said as Jack helped her into her robe, "about the baby's room." "What about it?" Jack asked, though he already knew. Rosa had been planning their child's nursery with the same meticulous care she'd once devoted to lesson plans. "I want to paint a mural on one wall, something beautiful, mountains and wildflowers, maybe a sunrise. Something that will remind our children that they were born in the most beautiful place on earth." "Children?" Jack raised an eyebrow, smiling. "Planning ahead, are we?" Rosa blushed prettily. "Well, I hope this won't be our only baby. I'd like at least 3 or 4. Jack pulled her into his arms, marveling at how domestic dreams had replaced the nightmares that used to plague his sleep. "Mrs. Morrison, are you planning to populate all of Colorado Territory with little Morrisons?" "Maybe," Rosa replied with mock seriousness. "Someone has to civilize this wild frontier, and I figure our children will be perfectly suited for the job. Brave like their father, stubborn like their mother, and beautiful like both of us." Jack laughed, the sound echoing through their small house like music. "I love you, Rosa Morrison. I love your ambition, your optimism, and your complete confidence that we can handle whatever the future brings." "I love you too, Jack Morrison. And speaking of the future," Rosa paused, her expression growing thoughtful. "Sheriff Bradley came by yesterday while you were helping Tom rebuild his barn. He had an interesting proposition." Jack's smile faded slightly. Any proposition involving the sheriff usually meant trouble, and Jack had sworn to avoid trouble for Rosa's sake. "What kind of proposition?" "The territorial governor is looking for men with your particular skills to help train law enforcement officers. Not gunfighting, Jack. Teaching them how to read dangerous situations, how to handle confrontations without violence, how to keep the peace in growing towns." Jack stared at his wife, processing what she just told him. "They want me to teach lawmen? They want you to use your experience to make other men better at their jobs. Think about it, Jack. You've seen every kind of dangerous situation imaginable. You know how to spot trouble before it starts, how to de-escalate conflicts, how to protect innocent people. Why shouldn't that knowledge be put to good use?" The idea was so unexpected, so completely different from anything Jack had ever imagined for his future, that he needed a moment to wrap his mind around it. "What do you think?" he asked finally. "About me working with lawmen instead of avoiding them?" Rosa's smile was radiant. "I think it's perfect. I think it's exactly what you were meant to do with the rest of your life. You've spent years being the most dangerous man in the territory. Now you can spend the rest of your years making sure other men don't have to be dangerous at all." That afternoon, Jack walked through Millbrook with a different perspective than he'd had since returning. Instead of seeing a place where he'd found refuge from his violent past, he saw a community that had welcomed him, accepted him, and now trusted him enough to offer him a role in building a safer future for everyone. He found Rosa in their garden, tending the vegetables they'd planted together. She was humming softly, one hand resting on her stomach as she worked, and Jack felt his heart swell with so much love, he thought it might burst. "Rosa," he said, settling on the garden bench they'd built together, "I've been thinking about what you said this morning, about the job, about the future." Rosa straightened, wiping her hands on her apron. And I realized something. For years I've been running from who I was, the gunslinger, the killer, the man everyone feared. But maybe I've been looking at it all wrong. How so? Jack was quiet for a moment, organizing his thoughts. Maybe the point isn't to run from who I was. Maybe the point is to use who I was to become who I'm meant to be. You've always seen something in me that I couldn't see in myself, something worth loving, worth believing in. Rosa moved to sit beside him, taking his hand in both of hers. "What do you see when you look at yourself now?" Jack looked around their garden, their home, the town that had become their sanctuary. "I see a man who's learned that the most important battles aren't won with guns. They're won with patience, with kindness, with the decision to build something better, instead of just tearing down what's wrong. And I see a man who's ready to teach other men the same thing." Jack turned to face Rosa fully. "I want to take the job, Rosa. I want to use what I've learned to help make the frontier safer for families like ours." Rosa's smile was brilliant enough to outshine the afternoon sun. "I was hoping you'd say that." That evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Jack felt a deep sense of completion settling over him. The restlessness that had driven him from town to town, the violence that had defined his reputation, the loneliness that had nearly destroyed him, all of it had led to this moment, to this life, to this woman who'd seen past his legend to his heart. "Jack," Rosa said softly, "do you ever think about what we'll tell our children about your past?" Jack considered the question. "I think we'll tell them the truth, that their father made mistakes, that he hurt people, that he was lost for a long time. But we'll also tell them that love has the power to redeem anyone, that it's never too late to choose a different path, and that the most important thing isn't where you've been, it's who you choose to become." "And what have you chosen to become?" Jack looked at his wife, beautiful, brave Rosa, who'd waited for him through 5 years of separation and loved him through his darkest moments. "A better man than I was yesterday. A father who will teach his children that strength comes from protecting others, not hurting them. A husband who will love his wife until his dying breath." Rosa leaned against his shoulder, her hand finding his and intertwining their fingers. "I love the man you've become, Jack Morrison, but I also love the man you were when you first rode into Millbrook all those years ago, broken and lost and afraid to hope for anything better." "Why?" Jack asked, genuinely curious. "Why did you love me then, when I had nothing to offer you but danger and uncertainty?" Rosa was quiet for a moment, watching the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky. "Because even then, beneath all that fear and violence, I could see your heart. I could see that you were a man capable of great love, great sacrifice, great change. I just had to wait for you to see it too." "And now?" Rosa smiled, placing Jack's hand over her growing belly where their child rested safe and loved. "Now I get to watch you become the father I always knew you could be. Now I get to build a family with the best man I've ever known. Now I get to wake up every morning knowing that the legendary Lightning Morrison chose to love me more than he loved his freedom, his reputation, or his fear." As if summoned by their conversation, a shooting star streaked across the Colorado sky, brilliant and brief and beautiful. "Make a wish," Rosa whispered. Jack closed his eyes but found he had nothing to wish for. Everything he'd ever wanted was already here in his arms. Rosa's love, their growing family, a future filled with purpose and peace, and the kind of happiness he'd never dared to imagine. "What did you wish for?" Rosa asked. "Nothing," Jack replied honestly. "I have everything I could ever want." Rosa laughed. The sound pure joy carried on the mountain wind. "Then wish for our children. Wish for their happiness, their safety, their chance to grow up in a world where love is stronger than fear. Jack opened his eyes and looked at his wife, this remarkable woman who taught him that legends could change, that killers could become protectors, that the most dangerous man in the territory could become someone worthy of love and trust and faith. "I wish," he said quietly, "that our children will know they are loved beyond measure, that they will have the courage to follow their hearts even when the path is difficult, and that they will understand that their father's greatest victory wasn't won with a gun. It was won the day he convinced their mother to take a chance on forever." Rosa's eyes filled with happy tears. "That's a beautiful wish. It's a beautiful life," Jack replied, kissing her softly as the Colorado night settled around them like a blessing. Years later, when Jack Morrison had become known throughout the territory, not as Lightning Morrison the gunslinger, but as Marshall Morrison the peacekeeper, when their house was filled with the laughter of 4 children who bore Rosa's gentle nature and Jack's quiet strength, when their love story had become legend in its own right, people would still talk about the day the most dangerous man in the West hung up his guns for love. But Jack and Rosa knew the truth. He hadn't given up being dangerous. He just learned to direct that danger toward protecting the things that mattered most: his family, his community, and the future they were building together one day at a time. Because sometimes the greatest legends aren't written with bullets and blood. Sometimes they're written with patience and kindness, with second chances and chosen love, with the radical decision to believe that anyone can change if they find someone worth changing for. Jack Morrison had been many things: an orphan, a killer, a legend, a coward. But the title he wore with the most pride was the simplest one of all: Rosa's husband and the father of their children. The most dangerous man in the territory had become the most devoted family man in Colorado, and he'd never looked back. Sometimes coming home was the greatest adventure of all. Sometimes the most wanted man was exactly the man someone needed most. And sometimes, if you were very lucky and very brave, love really could conquer everything, even the ghosts of who you used to be. And so, in the Colorado Territory of 1885, the most feared gunslinger in the American West learned that sometimes the greatest victory isn't the one won with bullets. It's the one won with the courage to come home and fight for love instead of running from it. Jack Lightning Morrison discovered that legends could be rewritten, that reputations built on violence could be transformed into legacies built on protection and peace. His journey from the most dangerous man in 3 territories to devoted husband and father proves that no one is too broken to deserve love, and no past is too dark to find redemption. Rosa Whitman. Morrison showed us what real strength looks like: the strength to wait for someone who's worth waiting for, the courage to forgive without forgetting, and the wisdom to see past someone's reputation to their heart. Her faith in Jack's capacity for change didn't just save him. It transformed him into the man he was always meant to be. Together, they proved that the most revolutionary act 2 people can commit isn't rebellion against society. It's the decision to choose love over fear, trust over suspicion, and building a future together over protecting themselves from potential heartbreak. Their love story became the foundation for a family that would help civilize the frontier through compassion rather than conquest. But Jack and Rosa's story opens up so many questions that keep us thinking long after their final sunset in the Colorado mountains. What happened to the children they dreamed of having? Did their sons inherit Jack's legendary skill with weapons, or did they choose different paths entirely? How did their daughters navigate growing up as the children of the most famous reformed gunslinger in the territory? The transformation of Jack Morrison from killer to peacekeeper suggests an entire universe of stories waiting to be told. What adventures did he have training lawmen across the frontier? What challenges did he face from men who couldn't believe Lightning Morrison had truly changed? How did his reputation evolve from feared legend to respected teacher? We're fascinated by the practical aspects of their life together. How did Rosa handle the constant stream of young gunslingers who came to test themselves against her husband's reputation? What was it like raising children who bore one of the most famous names in the West? How did Jack balance his new role as educator and peacekeeper with his responsibilities as father and husband? The themes of redemption and second chances that run through their story resonate powerfully with our modern world. How many people today are trapped by reputations they've outgrown, defined by mistakes they've learned from, or haunted by versions of themselves they no longer want to be? Jack's transformation reminds us that it's never too late to choose who we want to become. Rose's character challenges everything we think we know about women in the 1800s. Her strength, independence, and refusal to be protected, rather than partnered with, makes her revolutionary for her time. What other stories could we tell about frontier women who refused to accept the limitations society placed on them? What about the female teachers, doctors, and business owners who helped civilize the West through education and determination rather than violence? The role of community in Jack and Rose's love story also raises interesting questions. Millbrook's acceptance of their unconventional romance and their support during the wedding preparations shows us how important social networks were for survival and happiness on the frontier. What other tales might we explore about communities that chose inclusion over exclusion, understanding over judgment? Jack's evolution from gunslinger to lawman trainer represents a fascinating historical possibility. What if more dangerous men of the frontier had chosen to use their skills for peace rather than violence? How might the history of the American West have been different if legendary fighters had become legendary protectors instead? The pregnancy subplot in our final chapter opens up rich material for future stories. What kind of father would a reformed gunslinger make? How would he handle teaching his children about violence and protection while trying to raise them in peace? What challenges would the Morrison children face growing up with such a famous father? We're also curious about the long-term effects of Jack's decision to work with territorial law enforcement. Did his training methods really make a difference in how conflicts were resolved? What resistance did he face from traditionalists who believed the only good outlaw was a dead outlaw? How did his reputation as Lightning Morrison help or hinder his effectiveness as an educator? The romantic elements of Jack and Rose's relationship offer inspiration for anyone who's ever wondered if real love can survive real challenges. Their journey from separation to reunion to marriage shows us that sometimes the most precious things in life are worth waiting for, worth fighting for, and worth changing for. Tell us in the comments, what aspect of Jack and Rose's love story resonated most with you? Was it Jack's courage in coming home despite his fear? Rose's strength in refusing to give up on love? Their partnership in facing danger together? Or their proof that people really can change when they find someone worth changing for? What other characters from this story deserve their own tales? We're particularly intrigued by Judge Harrison, who traveled from Denver just to perform their wedding ceremony. What experiences taught him to recognize true love when he saw it? What about Sheriff Bradley, who seemed to understand that sometimes the law and justice aren't the same thing? What stories might we tell about lawmen who had to choose between following rules and doing what's right? Here's something else to consider. This story took place during a time when the American West was transitioning from lawless frontier to settled territory. Jack's transformation mirrors that larger social change, from a place where might made right to a community where cooperation and mutual respect created safety and prosperity. What other stories could we explore about individuals and communities navigating that massive cultural shift? The themes of chosen family versus blood family that we've explored in previous stories continue here in Jack and Rose's decision to build their own definition of what family means. Their future children will grow up understanding that family isn't just about blood, it's about the daily choice to love, protect, and support each other. How might their parenting philosophy influence the next generation of frontier families? Don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Stories for more incredible tales of love that conquers fear, legends who choose redemption over reputation, and the courage to believe that everyone deserves a second chance at happiness. But most importantly, share your thoughts in the comments below. What stories do you want us to tell next? Should we follow the Morrison family as their children grow up? Explore more tales of dangerous men finding redemption through love? Tell stories about the communities that chose acceptance over fear when legendary figures sought to start over. Your engagement helps us understand what themes resonate most powerfully with your own experiences of love, change, and the ongoing challenge of becoming better than who we used to be. What would you have done in Rose's situation? Would you have had the strength to wait 5 years for someone who left without explanation? More importantly, would you have had the courage to trust them with your heart again after they'd already broken it once? Share your thoughts about the difference between love that changes people and love that tries to control them. Tell us about relationships in your own life where someone chose to become better because of love rather than in spite of it. Help us understand what modern audiences want to see in stories about redemption, second chances, and the transformative power of unconditional acceptance. What impossible transformations have you witnessed in your own life? Have you ever seen someone completely reinvent themselves for love? Have you ever been the person who changed or the person who inspired change in someone else? Until next time, remember, the most beautiful love stories are often the ones where two people help each other become the best versions of themselves. Where love doesn't demand perfection, it inspires growth. Where the past doesn't define the future, it just provides the foundation for building something better. Jack Morrison's journey from Lightning the Killer to Jack the Protector reminds us that legends can be rewritten, that reputations can be rebuilt, and that it's never too late to choose love over fear, building over destroying, hope over despair. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is trust someone with your heart. Sometimes the most wanted men are the ones who want nothing more than to be worthy of love. And sometimes if you're very brave and very patient, the person you're waiting for will find the courage to come home and fight for the future you both deserve. Thanks for joining us in Colorado territory, where legends learn to love and love learn to conquer everything, even the ghosts of who we used to be. Now tell us, what legendary transformation should we witness next? What impossible love story should we explore in the wild, beautiful, dangerous frontier where anything could happen and everything was possible? The West is wide, the stories are endless, and love always finds a way to win in the end. What victory should we celebrate next?